Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. If at any time you're unable to hear me, I want you to stand up, jump up and down, get my attention. I want to make sure we don't have any problems with hearing this morning. So thank you for that introduction. First of all, I would like you to raise your hand if you have education background in civil engineering or surveying. Okay. How many of you consider yourselves to be map makers or cartographers? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you have heard of the Matthes-Evans Map? Raise your hand. And if you have, if you are familiar with that map, have you ever asked yourselves, how in the heck did they do that? Okay, so you probably have, because this was a map made in the early 1900s when the technologies, the instruments that were available were very, very different from today. I do want to add just one thing to my introduction. Our son has 2 degrees in geography from Arizona State University, so thank you to what was formerly called the Department of Geography, and thank you, Professor Mike Kuby, for being his advisor. So the Matthes-Evans Map was truly a fantastic effort, a herculean effort to map the Grand Canyon in the early 1900s. Probably the most impressive piece of mapping activity ever at the Grand Canyon. The map was published in 1927. The name Matthes-Evans comes from the 2 topographers that created the map, employed by the U.S. Geological Survey, Francois Matthes and Richard T. Evans. And Matthew Toro will talk later about the pronunciation of Matthes. Most people know it as Matthes, so that's the pronunciation I'm going to use today. The next topographic map of the Grand Canyon, as was mentioned earlier, didn't come until the 1960s. So this map was the one that was in use for quite a long, long period of time. So what does it take to be a good topographer? I've been thinking about it. This is my list. If you're good in math, love geometry and trigonometry, like to camp out 7 days a week, hike 20 miles a day, can deal with horses and mules, and get along with your boss in Washington, D.C., then you could be a great topographer. And if you happen to have really good cursive writing, you could be Francois Matthes. I've had occasion to read about 100 pages of letters in his cursive writing. It was really quite phenomenal. We know that the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, Charles Walcott, visited the Grand Canyon in 1901. That certainly was not his first time visiting the Grand Canyon, but he did visit in 1901. One of the ways we know that is that he signed the hotel register at William Wallace Bass's Bass Camp, located about 12 or 15 miles west of Grand Canyon Village. It was one of the tourist camps or locations that was visited at the canyon at that period of time. He did sign in on the register in 1901, and maybe he had already decided that we should have a topographic map of the Grand Canyon. Maybe he decided that while he was here. We don't know. But shortly thereafter, he appointed Francois Matthes to be the topographer to create this new map. Matthes had done other topographic work in the West. He had mapped 3 mountain ranges. In 1905, he wrote, having successfully wrestled with and conquered in turn 3 tall mountain ranges in the West, the writer next found himself commissioned with the survey of a hole in the ground. The effort began in March of 1902. The extent of the Matthes-Evans map ran from the mouth of Marble Canyon to the mouth of Havasu Creek, basically covered the footprint of what would become Grand Canyon National Park many, many years later in 1919. 105 river miles between those 2 locations, a total of over 1,100 square miles in area, over 760 of those square miles within the canyon. Now, one of the first things that the topographers had to do was to determine well, where exactly is this Grand Canyon? Where is it located north, south, east, west? Where is it latitude and longitude? And to do this task, they engaged in an activity called heliotroping. There were some known points on the map: Kendrick Peak, Bill Williams Mountain, Mount Floyd, located down south. The exact locations of those peaks were known, and through triangulation you could figure out where a point at the Grand Canyon or points at the Grand Canyon were located. But those are extremely long distances from those mountains to the canyon rim. Pretty hard to see those distances, even through a surveyor's instrument or telescope. Well, they engaged in a process called heliotroping, and this is a device. You'll see on the left of this box there's a small mirror, and then in the middle on the right-hand end of the box there are some sights that you can line up with a distant point. One member of the team would be at a place like Hopi Point or Comanche Point on the south rim of the canyon. They would use this mirror and they would attempt to reflect sunlight so that it would hit one of those distant peaks. And then another member of the team, they would have their surveying instrument there and they would know exactly how many degrees east or west of true north that location on the canyon rim was. And they did this for a number of points at the Grand Canyon, and through triangulation determined exactly where on the landscape this Grand Canyon was located. And very interestingly, one of the first things they learned is the Grand Canyon was about 3 miles further north and a little bit further west than it had been shown on previous maps. Once they had established some points at the canyon, then they would do triangulation on a smaller basis, about 26 triangulation stations at various points around the Grand Canyon, many of them on the canyon rim, also some at points away from the canyon rim like Red Butte, Shinimore Altar, other locations. Another early task, we've talked here about, well, where is the canyon north, south, east, west, but what about elevation? How high is the rim of the Grand Canyon? There was a known point of elevation, a benchmark along the railroad track down in Williams that had been previously determined. The surveyors had to run a line of levels along the railroad track from Williams up to the Grand Canyon. So you have someone with a surveyor's transit, or you can look through the telescope horizontally, and then another member of the team would hold a rod. That's a big stick with measurements on it in feet, in tenths of feet, hundredths of a feet. They would have to run all the way up the railroad line from Williams and first determine a location at the very end of the railroad track, and indeed there is a benchmark, or was a benchmark at the very end of the railroad track, and then they would use a similar technique to go to other points along the canyon rim. And then ultimately, there were 3 locations where they ran lines of levels down into the canyon, following the Bright Angel, the New Hants, and the North and South Bass trails. So even today, you can go down along those trails. If you know where to look, you can find some of those benchmarks. Here's one at the top of the Red Wall, very close to the Bright Angel Trail. So I mentioned earlier the Matthes-Evans Map was prepared, just happened to cover an area that would coincide with the later Grand Canyon National Park. The U.S. Geological Survey normally has a grid system for quadrangles. Now, this area of the Grand Canyon didn't quite fit their conventional grid. You see in green up here the footprint of the future Grand Canyon National Park. If you used the conventional grid of 15-minute quadrangles, you would have quadrangles located like this, superimposed on the Grand Canyon. Now, nowadays, you will find quadrangles that have been prepared by USGS for those 6 quadrangles. The names are shown up there, but that didn't work exactly right for them in 1902-03. These are the locations of the 4 quadrangles that they prepared and created. And in fact, separate individual quadrangle maps were originally prepared for each of those 4. And later consolidated to create the Matthes-Evans Map. And those began with the Bright Angel, surveyed in 1902-03. Matthes is the principal photographer, published in 1906 as a Bright Angel quadrangle. The Vishnu Quadrangle, published in 1907. Both Matthes and Evans were involved in surveying that in 1902-03. The Shinemu Quadrangle, published in 1908. Richard Evans was the topographer. And up at the top, I'm showing the amount of field time that was required for each of these. The entire map was a total of 38 months of field work. It was not until 1921 that they did some work on Supai, and there was a quadrangle published in 1921, and then a larger Supai that was published in 1923. But even then, you did not quite cover all of the footprint of Grand Canyon National Park. So then there was some additional field work in 1923 to cover the rest of the park. Finally, it was all completed, and here are examples of each of those individual quadrangle maps that were published. First was the Bright Angel, Vishnu, Shinemo, and the 1923 Supai. And they were consolidated to publish the Matthes-Evans Map in 1927 as a two-piece map, east half and west half. A couple of unusual things about this map. It was printed at a scale of 1 to 48,000. That's unconventional. And it was published with 50-foot contour intervals. That was also a bit unusual, but Matthes made the case for doing that to bring out some highlights in the map. So it was unusual from that standpoint as well. That map served us until the mid-1960s, when there were other, as mentioned earlier, maps that were produced based on photogrammetry. I want to say a little bit more about triangulation stations. There were several of these on the rim. Here is an example. If they had wood locally available, they'd have poles about 12 feet long, create a tripod, wrap a white sheet around it. You wanted to be able to see this from many, many miles away, maybe even from across the canyon. So there are a couple of examples. If you were in the lower elevations where there wasn't locally available wood, you would build a cairn. And this is not a hiking cairn like you'd find along a trail. This is a hiking cairn that I cannot quite reach the top when I stand next to it. They are quite large. I had a really interesting experience last summer. I went out to a location where one of these triangulation stations had been set up in 1903. This is what I found. The wood and the baling wire is still there, and down in the middle you can see the benchmark that was originally established. Many places around the canyon where you can find their benchmarks. This was on Cape Final in the North Rim, the 1903 date. But you're probably still wondering, how did they create all those contour intervals? How do you get from something that looks like this when you see it from the rim and create a map that looks like this? Plane table surveying was the method that was used. If we zoom in here on the plane table, it's about 2 feet by 3 feet in size with a sheet of paper on it. There's a telescope, a surveyor's instrument, and then there is a brass ruler down on the paper. The brass ruler will turn as you turn your telescope left and right, so that when you sight in on a particular feature, you can draw a line on the paper. And you are also able to get some vertical angles when you're sighting on points in the canyon. That you can go through your trigonometry and calculate elevations when you have vertical angles. But let's just talk about moving left to right horizontally. You might be looking out into the canyon, such as this, a view of Vishnu Temple, and see various features out there on Vishnu Temple. You would run a scribe with your pencil on your paper on your plane table. You would start to sketch in some of the things that you saw. You would run your scribes to denote cliff faces, for example, the yellow lines that I have marked there. You'd begin to sketch those in. Then there'd be more and more of those yellow lines, and you'd be sketching in more and more of those. And that would give you some sense of what this terrain looked like from one perspective. Then you can go around and look at that same feature, Vishnu Temple, from some other point on the canyon rim. Again, trying to pinpoint those locations where you had those yellow lines in your head. And then you might find that point sticking out there, maybe it wasn't really at A, it really had to move out to point A1, or the one that was B had to move out to the other B. So then you were, in essence, triangulating on all of these individual features out in the canyon. So when you were all done, and when you'd also incorporated your information about vertical angles to determine elevation, you'd be able to create something that looked like that. Of course, from a single point, or even from a couple of points on the canyon rim, you probably would not be able to see everything within the Grand Canyon. There are temples, buttes, there's ridges, there's hillsides. In fact, Nicholas Bach has an interesting presentation where he takes a historic photograph like this and then shows what is really the view shed, what is the part of the landscape you can really see. So yes, the topographers had to go to many, many locations on the canyon rim in order to capture everything. But Matthes wrote that in the east part of the canyon, let's say upriver from Unkar Delta, where the canyon is very broad and very wide, they were able to map all of that part of the canyon without ever setting foot within the canyon. They were, for any point within the canyon, they could always find at least a couple of places from which they could do their plane table surveying. Not true further downstream where you have the inner gorge, where it's very deeply incised into the canyon. I want to finish up with a handful of different anecdotes related to the making of the map. I had mentioned Bass Camp, located out 15 miles west of Grand Canyon Village. William Wallace Bass's wife, Ada Bass, kept a really good diary. She has an account of one night there was a knock on the door, and I'll back up here and tell you why there was a knock on the door in the middle of the night. One of the U.S. Geological Survey teams had gone down the Bass Trail. They were on the north side of the river surveying. They had run out of provisions or getting low. They sent one of their crew back to Bass Camp to try to fetch more provisions. The man's name was Walker. He got to the north bank of the river, needing to cross to the south bank, and Mr. Bass's boat was on the south bank. He was on the north bank. That was a problem. He took off his clothes, put them on top of his head, and swam across the river. Walker made it across the river, but his clothes did not. This was early April. It was cold outside. He walked a couple miles up the trail to a place called Rock Camp, where he found an old blanket and he found a burro. He wrapped himself in the blanket, climbed on the burro, and made it out to Bass Camp and knocked on Ada's door in the middle of the night. I don't have photos of the burro or mule that was named Brigham or Mr. Walker, but they probably looked something like this. Unreliable boats were not the only reason that Matthes decided to purchase a steel boat. There were two fellows who drowned attempting to cross the river in a wooden boat in, I believe it was 1903. Matthes promptly ordered a two-piece steel boat, 68 pounds a piece, purchased for $28 plus shipping that his crews used for surveying. There's also a really interesting story about one of the rodmen in the crew was named George W. Parkins. This inscription existed along the river for decades and decades and decades, no one knowing who this guy George W. Parkins was. I could give you a 20-minute story of how I researched this and sleuthed it out and finally determined for sure that George W. Parkins was a member of the surveying team that mapped the canyon. Working on the Vishnu Quadrangle in around 1905, again, there's entries in the Bass Camp Hotel Register documenting the people that were involved, Richard T. Evans, for example. And then finally, there's the story of doing the line of levels down the New Hants Trail on a very hot summer day. I believe it was don't remember if it was 03 or 04. At 6 a.m. it was 96 degrees. Now, the surveying instrument that they were using for their line of levels had a bubble in it, very similar to a carpenter's level, something like this. As the day advanced, the level bubble would grow smaller and smaller until by noon it would vanish altogether and the work had to be stopped. By that time also, the ground was so hot that the levelman could not stand still at his instrument, being obliged to lift his feet in alternation in order that he not burn them on the hobnails of his shoes. So I do now want to close, as Paul Hurt mentioned earlier, we are celebrating history of the Grand Canyon right now. The centennial was a couple of days ago. Francois Matthes kept a set of field notes, but actually it's as much a personal diary as it is field notes. One of the great historical occasions at the Grand Canyon was a visit by President Theodore Roosevelt on May 6, 1903. This is Francois Matthes' entry in his field notes for that day. Exciting day. President Roosevelt's train arrives at the Grand Canyon at 9 a.m. Roosevelt rides to Rouse Point, and that's what we would now call Hopi Point, in the forenoon, gives a brief address at 11 a.m., then starts on a fast ride to Grandview Point. Now, you probably know Grandview Point is, 10 miles away from Grand Canyon Village? To Grandview Point, Hants guiding. Governor Brody was one of his Rough Riders in Cuba. Governor Brody straining his back and comes back home in a carriage. One other takes a somersault. President leaves at 6 p.m. But I want to go back to the address that President gave at 11 o'clock. Probably one of the most meaningful speeches ever given at the Grand Canyon. He said, "Leave it as it is. We cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. Keep it for your children and your children's children, and all who come after you, as the one great sight that every American should see. And I would add that every good geographer should map." Thank you.
We have time for questions. One question, anybody? One lucky person. Going once? All right.
I don't want to steal anybody else's thunder, but I was fascinated to see the hotel register at the beginning of your presentation. The name underneath the person was G.K. Gilbert. For those who don't know, Grove Carl Gilbert was one of the most famous of all American geologists. He was Powell's right-hand man on his survey crew through the West in 1874 to 1879 and did a tremendous amount himself. I couldn't believe the two of them signed in next to each other in that. So that's, and Ed Edding will be happy to say that's the kind of wonderful nuggets of gold that you'll find when you're digging through the archive.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the comment, Paul.